I'd like to talk briefly about the history of the Old Testament text. How did we get the Old Testament? And what are the remains of the history or the past of the Old Testament that we possess today? Think to yourself, you have, I assume, everybody that might listen to this has access to or has in your possession an English translation of the Old Testament. That English translation is the result of a several thousand-year process by which that text has been passed along to you. Now, where did it come from? How did it get here? And what's the story behind it? And I'd like to give just some brief glimpses into that history by highlighting some of the parts of that tradition by which the text of the Old Testament has arrived to us today. And let me begin by saying that if we were talking about this subject, say 100 years ago, or 120 or 30 years ago, actually far less than that, if we were having this conversation, let's say 80 years ago or 90 years ago, we would find ourselves relatively limited on the resources that we have, at least in this sense. 80 years ago or 90 years ago, the oldest physical copies of the Old Testament books that we would possess would be roughly 1,000 years old. They would go back to roughly 900 AD or so, or 900 to 1000 AD. You would find copies like that in a few museums here and there who had 1,000-year-old texts of the Old Testament. Well, that sounds quite old, and it is quite old, 1,000 years old. However, it would be more than 1,000 years after the original writing of those books, because we wouldn't have any of the original copies of the Old Testament books. Those had long since disintegrated or long since passed away, so far as we know. So we wouldn't have those original copies of the Old Testament. What we would have are copies very far removed from the original writing of those texts. Now, there would be no strong reason to think that those texts had been tampered with or altered significantly or damaged as far as their original reading, at least not in any intentional way. Because it seems from all evidences that we have that the text of Scripture was taken very seriously as being something to be protected and preserved. In other words, the biblical text was always thought to be something very precious that was to be carefully passed along from one generation to the next. And so what you would have is very serious Jews, scholars, down through the centuries, who would take the text of Scripture, they would very carefully and painstakingly copy it, and then the older copies would pass out of use, often, sometimes to be buried out of respect for the text themselves, and then they would have fresh new copies that would faithfully transmit the message of the text down to the next century or to the next generation. For example, you had a group of people called the Masoretes, who between the years of roughly 500 or so and 700 or 800 A.D. Took it to themselves to take the various manuscripts of Scripture that they possess and to take them and to compare them, to contrast them, and to try to create or to develop the most pure form of the biblical text possible. And what I mean by the most pure form is if you take handwritten copies of texts and put them next to each other. Like if I were to take, if you were to copy a document 10 times, and by hand you were to copy it, and we were to take those 10 copies and put them down on a desk and to compare them word by word, we would probably find, pretty quickly in fact, we would probably find variations between those handwritten copies that you made. What we would almost certainly not have are 10 identical manuscripts or handwritten texts. What we would find are variations between those different texts. Maybe misspelled words, maybe a word would drop out because your eyes, as you looked at the text and then turned back and copied it, might have left out a word or dropped out a word, or maybe your eyes, because of just tiredness or just human error, your eyes, as you looked back and forth between the manuscripts, maybe your eyes fell on a certain word that's repeated on 2 lines and you left out a few words. There's all kinds of human error that enters into handwritten texts or copies of things. Now, the ancient Jews, the Masoretes being a great example of this, were scholars who tried to minimize the presence of human error by coming up with very careful ways of counting the number of letters on a page, by very carefully counting the number of letters, and if they found any errors, they would discard with the document because they wanted to make sure that they had the most perfect copy of the text that was humanly possible. And so there were great efforts expended to try to determine the correct reading of the Scripture and to pass it along correctly. That text, that Hebrew text, that the Masoretes developed by very careful comparison of texts and development of methods for making sure that the text was transmitted properly is called the Masoretic Text. And the Masoretic Text is the one that we would have had if we had taken, talked about this subject 80 or 90 years ago. We would go back and find that the documents that were, say, 1,000 years old, the copies of the Old Testament, were in fact those that were copies of the Masoretic Text, that produced by these great scholars who wanted to develop a way of preserving the text and passing it along to new generations. However, since that time, 90 years ago or so, there was a fantastic discovery that was made in the Judean desert around the Dead Sea. In the 1940s, there was, according to one of the stories it's told, there was a Bedouin boy who was wandering around the desert there by the caves around the Dead Sea. And if you go to the Dead Sea, you'll see pockets in the walls of the mountains around the Dead Sea that were places where some of these scrolls that I'm about to tell you about were found. But this Bedouin boy was playing around in the caves looking for a lost donkey or sheep or something, and he stumbles upon some rolled up pieces of leather. He takes those into town and sells them, and those rolled up pieces of leather turned out to be ancient copies of biblical books. Scholars were able to go back and find where those scrolls were found, those pieces of leather with this writing on them, what's called vellum, leather animal skins, and they would go back and they would find the remains of an ancient library there around the Dead Sea in the caves. And that became known as what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls include portions, pieces, and sometimes whole manuscripts of all of the books practically that we find in the Old Testament, plus other books that were special books of the religious community called the Essenes that was nearby to the Dead Sea caves. That discovery of manuscripts, that community, that religious community, and presumably the library of that community, which was placed in the caves nearby, the discovery of that library there is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that community there was destroyed by the Romans about 1,000 years before the oldest manuscripts that we had before. Around the year 70 A.D., the Essene community was destroyed by the Romans, it appears, and they, of course, their library sat in the caves there, disturbed sometimes, and some weather erosion and so on. But the library itself remained there in the caves for the next virtually 2,000 years. And so some of the scrolls there around the Dead Sea, or in the caves there by the Dead Sea, some of those scrolls dated back to before the time of Jesus. And so that gave to us the ability, to scholars who do such things, it gave to them the ability to compare and contrast the Masoretic text, let's say, of 1,000 AD or 900 AD or 800 AD. They could take that text and compare it to texts from 800, 900, 1,000 years before those texts. And what they discover is remarkable continuity in the text. Perhaps the most famous and exciting example of this is a complete scroll of the prophecies of Isaiah, a Hebrew scroll of Isaiah's prophecies. Isaiah is one of the longest books of the Old Testament, 66 chapters long. And Isaiah's book, found there among the Dead Sea Scrolls, gives to us remarkable evidence that the translator or the copyists of scriptures that passed it along from generation to generation in their copying of the scriptures had done a magnificent job passing it along. And so it increases, I think, our confidence in the transmission of the biblical text down through the centuries, that we have a basically intact and reliable copy of the various biblical books, because the people who cared about these books cared first and foremost about making sure that they were properly passed along, not that they altered them or changed them. And if you think about it, these are people who love these texts. They live these texts. They quote these texts all the time. They read them in their worship. It's part of who they are. And therefore, they don't tamper with it, because everybody would know that. They know these texts. They're part of their rhythm of life. And so it makes sense that from generation to generation, these texts were preserved and protected as much as is humanly possible, intact and without major flaw or error. Now, there are other ways in which we have received the Old Testament text. And let me mention to you a couple of the more important ones. For example, we have an ancient Latin translation of the text of Scripture that has been used for many centuries. In fact, in the Catholic Church, the Latin translation produced by St. Jerome in the 4th century, Jerome produced what's called the Latin Vulgate. He translated the text of Scripture from Hebrew and Greek, both the Old and New Testaments. He translated it from the original languages into Latin so it could be used by Latin-speaking people. It was a very fine translation, and it became the standard Catholic translation or Latin-speaking translation for many centuries. In fact, even up to the present, in a revised form, the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome, it continues to be the name of the translation used in official Roman Catholic writings. There's also another important ancient translation of the Old Testament that we have in various forms as it's passed along through the centuries, and that's what's called the Greek Septuagint. The Greek Septuagint there's an ancient legend associated with it that there were 70 scholars who went into their own cells translating in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, pieces of the Old Testament. And when they would compare the pieces of the Old Testament, the parts of the Old Testament that they would translate, they found each time that they compared their translations that they were identical to one another. And they saw that as sort of divine stamp of approval on their translation. The end result of this work, and of course that's a legend and probably doesn't correspond to the facts about it, but what we do have is a very ancient, probably coming from the 1st to 2nd century BC, an ancient translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That Septuagint, as it's called, based on the number 70 in the Greek language, that translation of the Bible into Greek, or the Old Testament into Greek, functioned as sort of a standard Bible for Greek-speaking Jews and also Christians in the 1st century. It appears that the Septuagint is used in the New Testament on a number of occasions when the Old Testament is cited or referred to. And so the Septuagint is a very important translation. The Latin Vulgate is another very important translation. And then, of course, we have the Masoretic Text of the Hebrews, of the Hebrew scholars, the Masoretes. And, of course, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. It allows us to sort of test our translations by having actual physical copies of the Hebrew text of the Bible that date back to before the time of Jesus. So these are all very remarkable pieces of data that we have. We also have I could mention 2 or 3 other things very quickly that we have regarding the Old Testament Scriptures. For one, we have ancient translations of the Scriptures from Hebrew into the Aramaic language. The Hebrew people, when they were taken into Babylonian exile, they learned the Aramaic language, and scholars of the Old Testament would explain those Scriptures to the Hebrew people because they no longer spoke the Hebrew language, and so they would translate the Scriptures into the Aramaic language, and then they would explain the meaning of it. And we have a collection of these interpretations of the Old Testament that have survived through the centuries, and they are called the Aramaic Targums. Targum meaning translation or interpretation. And so that's another valuable source of information that we have. We also have the ancient Talmud. The Talmud is a collection of oral traditions about the meaning of the Old Testament that were written down roughly between the years 200 and 500 A.D. The Talmud is a valuable way of getting some insight into how the Old Testament was interpreted, and also giving to us references to the Old Testament, all of which allow us to compare and contrast what we have and what has survived through the centuries. So those are some of the things that we have. There are more things that we could talk about, but those are some of the pieces of data that we have about how the Old Testament text has come to us. What we should keep in mind is that the Old Testament was sort of transmitted, copied, translated into these different languages because people loved it. They wanted to live it. They wanted to hear it. They wanted to understand it. And so the text itself, although translated into different languages, was a very precious thing that they wanted to make sure they kept it pure and that they kept it intact. The interpretations of it may vary. The explanations of it may vary, and in fact they do. And that's an important distinction to be made between the text itself and the interpretation of the text. And I think the data, and some of which I've given to you here, the data that we have supports the idea that we basically can have confidence that the text of the Old Testament has come to us safely, and now we can go about the business of trying to actually understand it.